coming home of a little girl of mine. Her name is June, and very, very soon she'll belong to me.
Well, I was born in Westford, and I was born in the house right behind you, shaded now by trees. It's called today the Fletcher Tavern, and it certainly was the Fletcher home for many years. But it was my great-great-grandfather, Eleazar Hamlin, then a widower and father of 15 children, who somehow managed to get my great-great-stepmother, the widow Hildreth Fletcher, to marry him. And therefore there have been 5 generations of my family that have lived in this. I consider it the Hamlin house now, but it will always be the Fletcher Tavern. So I grew up there with my 3 siblings, my older sister Sarah, and our 2 brothers Charles and Henry. It was a lovely, idyllic life here in this small, small village. And I'll just tell you about some of the buildings that were around that are still standing in 1919 as I stand here in my adulthood telling you about my childhood in Westford. So just behind our house on Hildreth Street, there's a small house set back from the road. That house was not there originally. It was on Main Street, but my father had it moved there because we needed someone to help him care for our land. My father was a farmer, and he was also a carpenter. So he moved Dr. Drinkwater's house to our garden, and that's where the hired help would live were he a married man. The first person I remember there as a child living there was Jerry Sullivan. Jerry Sullivan had come here from Ireland, and he was very different, as I knew him, from many of the men. The family had left Ireland in the time of the Great Famine, and as I remember Jerry, he was a man superior to his position. He had a dignified manner, a serious face, and evidently belonged to a better class of Irish than many who left Ireland at that time. Now, across the street from our home lived my father's older brother, Nathan. And I remember that house so fondly. I must have been about 5 when Uncle Nathan and Aunt Harriet decided it was time to do some renovations. So they left the back ell, but they tore down the front of the house. Oh my heavens, what a disarray that was in that house at the time that they did that. The biggest problem was my Aunt Harriet. She was very, very upset because all of the fireplaces were going to go in the new renovation and be replaced with stoves. But my Aunt Harriet insisted on having one fireplace, not for cheer and comfort, but that she might be able to roast her Thanksgiving turkey in a tin kitchen before the open fire. So in her bedroom, a fireplace was built. And as far as I know, a fire was never lighted there, except on Thanksgiving morning. And next to that was where my Westford Academy was. The building that you and I just left was built on this site. George Washington was president then. As I knew the village better than the other sections of Westford, I can say that we had an unusually large percentage of cultivated men and women. And as I mentioned before, it was the academy and the library which were largely responsible for this fact. It is noticeable that in all towns in Massachusetts where an academy was established, the rate of intelligence was higher than in surrounding towns not fortunate enough to have that influential factor. Probably why I went on to become a teacher. You know now that the building was moved in 1916, and here we are only 3 years later in 1919. How different that lot looks. I still get the Westford Wardsman from my family, and they sent me an article when this was being moved. I was so interested to read that they said, the spot where the academy stood is rapidly being filled in and graded by a gang of workmen, and will soon add more spaciousness and beauty to John C. Abbott's grounds. Well, Mr. Abbott's house was right next door, just beyond that row of trees. And we'll see his house as we come back to Westford Common from our walk down Main Street at the end of our talk here today. Let us stay in the shade, but look toward the Orthodox Church. I wonder if the custom of tolling the bell on the death of a resident of the town is still continued in Westford. This church looks very different to me coming back now in 1919, because when I was a child, it was a much, much simpler building. It's interesting how it came to be a separate church from the meeting house across the common. In the early history of Westford, only one church stood in the village, not dignified, however, by the name church, for that would have been too suggestive of the religious tyranny of England from which the Puritans had fled. Instead, it was the meeting house. But under Channing, and it was used not only for religious services, but for secular meetings. But under Channing and other liberal and advanced thinkers, a split occurred among the members of the congregation in the late 1820s, I believe. The meeting house remained with the advanced or liberal members, and the conservative left and built the Orthodox Church, now standing on its original site at the southeast angle of the common. Later, the term Orthodox was gradually dropped and replaced by congregational. Now, beyond that, we have two buildings. John Fletcher built that house the year after I was born, so I remember it all my life. He came to Westford Center to farm, but within about 5 years, he felt that perhaps he would like to be a merchant. So he built the small general store next door, which stands there, and today it is still run by his grandson, J. Herbert Fletcher. In the middle of that time, John Bateman's son, John M. Fletcher, was a classmate of mine at Westford Academy. We're the same age. He built the addition, the rather elegant house with the turret, and that's where John B. lived at the time that he ran the store. But now it is his son, J. Herbert, and his daughter, Eva, who run that store together. Oh, what fun we had in that store, I assure you. Beyond that, it was the Osgood home. Oh, dear Dr. Benjamin Osgood. What a dear, dear doctor he was. I remember at first he made his rounds on horseback, and it wasn't until later when he was older that he took up riding town in a wagon. And it was Mr. Osgood's land just 40 years ago now, I believe in 1870, when the town decided that it needed its own building for town hall. Until then, the offices were in the bottom of the meeting house. It truly was both for religion and for secular uses, and that's where the town meeting was held as well. But the town decided it was time to build a townhouse for the town. But they wanted the property where you can see the beautiful townhouse sitting to this day, but they needed more. So Widow Osgood was approached, and they negotiated with her, but my friend Eliza would not be negotiated with, and so they took it, as that was their right. But Eliza was not sure that she'd gotten the proper dollar, and she took the town of Westford to court. God bless her. And she won, and she was awarded $800.33. I've always admired her for that. Well, I think you could all see the library from here, that beautiful new library that the town built in 1895. It takes my breath away. When I was a child, there was the social library in Westford. It had been founded the same year that Westford Academy was founded. But it lived in different people's homes. The books were bought by the people who were subscribers, but there were different families who would put it in their home. And that was the library in Westford in my childhood. I'm glad to say my older sister Sarah was in fact the library director for a few years before she became a teacher. So when they built the new town hall, the friends of the subscribers to the social library said, perhaps it's time that the town has our collection of books. So in 1859, they gave everything to the town, and when the townhouse was built, one special room, a commodious apartment, was built for the library so that the library could be there. But by 1880, they had outgrown that, and they decided to build their own building in 1895. The town meeting had put an article on the warrant. The selectmen had asked the town for $10,000. Oh, what a large sum of money. I couldn't believe it when I heard the town would spend $10,000 for a library. But at that town meeting, before the moderator, Mr. Fletcher, could read the article, the chairman of the Board of Selectmen, Sherman D. Fletcher, stood up and said he had a letter. He had a letter from J. Varnum Fletcher, who grew up in this town, visiting his grandparents down on Depot Street. And the letter said that Mr. Fletcher, whom we all know had gone on to be a very successful banker in Belmont, and also who had made a lot of money at the Faneuil Hall Market where he had his stores. His letter said, I have wanted to do something for my hometown of Westford, and so I would like to fund the new library. And he did, in its entirety. And when it cost $13,000, he said, I will pay that as well. And that is why, etched in stone over the front, it is the J.V. Fletcher Library, because he made it possible. That house was, it was there, put in that spot because of the unfortunate fire at the Bancroft Wright House in 1891. That had been a duplex house, and when it burned to the ground, the town negotiated with the two families to purchase that land, and therefore we were able to have our library facing the common, as did the town hall and our other buildings. Now, the townhouse, or the meeting house, really needs very little introduction. There has been a meeting house on that site since 1792. We became a town in 1729, but the first two burned, and this is the third meeting house on that site. And when it was built, and in my childhood, it was turned 90 degrees to where it is now. So let us walk across. I think we'll just cross at this corner of the street, and we will work our way down Main Street and talk a little bit more about the beautiful, beautiful townhouse. Follow me. Now, the townhouse changed twice in my lifetime. When I was born, it was one story all the way. You went in and you could see all the way up. However, in 1847, the year I was born, it was divided into an upper section for the church and for services, and a lower section which was for the town offices. And then in 1868 was when it was turned 90 degrees. My fondest memory, of course, of this was the amazing ball that was given when James Buchanan was inaugurated. Many of the villages had inaugural balls. I was only 10, but I was allowed to go. It was like a cotillion. It was the first that I had ever been to. As the ball was lighted only by oil lamps attached to various posts, the brilliant colors of the American flag and the buntings which decorated the hall were not very distinctly seen, but the costumes of the ladies were very up to date. I had the previous winter attended a dancing school, and I was crazy to dance. But this wonderful Buchanan Ball was not for children. However, my father took my sister Sarah and me to watch for a while. But what a delightful surprise. It happened that a cotillion had been formed and one couple was lacking. All the ladies were on the floor, and yet the set was incomplete. And just then, a tall man, as I looked up at him, he seemed 8 or 9 feet tall. And wonders of wonders, he asked me to dance with him. I was rather small for my age, but it must have been exceedingly funny to have seen this tall man. I remember he was William Hildreth. I found later he was 28 at the time, leading my hand for such a little girl. I can see him now leaning down to take my hand when the call, "All Promenade," was heard. No picture of my young days is more vivid in my mind than that dance in 1857 at the Buchanan Ball. So let us walk down this side of Main Street, and I will tell you about my friends, the Butterfields. The Butterfield family consisted of the father and mother, 2 daughters and a son. The oldest daughter name was Mary, and the younger Lydia. Members of them called them Lydiana. I think it was Mary had one of the first pianos in the village. The only ones I know about other than that were the one at the Amos Haywood Road family on the road to Graniteville, and another in Mr. Sherman Fletcher's house, which we'll walk by in a moment. But the first piano I ever saw was at the Butterfield home. And I can vision myself standing entranced as Mary touched the keys and brought forth what to me was wonderful music. Mary Butterfield was for several terms a teacher in the village school, but that was before my day. In the front hall, extending the length of the house, was a large hall, and that was the first dancing school that I ever attended. There was a small orchard, and beyond that was a store kept by Samuel Fletcher, father of Sherman Fletcher. Let's walk down to the Wright and Fletcher store. And he bought the house just beyond this one, lived there for a few years, but in 1848 he tore that house down and built himself the beautiful house that is still standing there in 1919, lived in by his great-granddaughters Gertrude and Julia Fletcher. And at the same time, he purchased the small store that was across the street. It had been there since 1813, but he tore that down as well. Grandiose plans for this end of Main Street, I'm sure. And he built the store that we see there now. His partner was Nahum Fletcher from Depot Street, thus the Wright and Fletcher store. Now, in the next generation, as I was growing older, Sherman D. Fletcher passed on the store to his son Sherman, who was a classmate of mine at Westford Academy. It was a small village, you know. And Nahum Wright passed it on to his son, who was called Dick Wright. And so it continued to be the Wright and Fletcher store. Here we are in 1919, and the Fletcher family has passed it on, and the Wrights. They've sold it to another good old Westford family, to the Days. And Bessie Day's husband, Sebastian Watson, runs it. And it's now the red and white store, of course. But it continues to be a general store, which means there are 3 general stores for us here in Westford Common, which is very helpful when I was a child. We could go to the Fletcher store on Lincoln Street. We could go to the Sherman Dewey Fletcher store, the Wright and Fletcher here. And next to the library, Mr. Swallow ran his store, Peter Swallow. You may have heard of Peter's daughter, Ellen. They actually moved to Westford because of the academy. She was a very, very, very smart woman. Went to Westford Academy after I did. She's about 10 years younger than I. But she went from Westford Academy to Vassar, and then she applied for admission to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where women were not accepted. But Ellen Swallow did not take no for an answer, so she applied again. And she was, in fact, as a Westford Academy graduate, the first woman ever accepted at MIT. Stayed there her entire professional life and became an instructor. What we call home economics, but it was far more than how to bake cakes. She really learned the science of keeping a home and keeping it sanitary, clean, and healthy. She created that, and that continues, I'm proud to say, in this day, thanks to Ellen Swallow, who married one of her professors, Professor Richardson, who was in fact younger than she, and they worked together at MIT for their professional lives. Now, while we are standing here, I can tell you about the mansion. I mentioned to you that when my Westford Academy was moved down to Boston Road, the grounds were filled in and groomed in order to extend the estate of Mr. John Abbott. Well, there has been an Abbott house on this property since the late 1700s, and Squire Abbott lived here until his death. And he left the property to his son, but he also left life tenancy of that to his companion, Rachel Blood, who had been his housekeeper since his wife's death. So for another 17 years, Rachel Blood lived in Squire Abbott's house. On her death, it was moved to Boston Road, where it still stands today in 1919. So that house was moved, and that was when John Abbott decided to build what the family called the mansion. And at the same time, He built the well house over the well that was already on the property. And in 1879, just about 25 years ago now, he built himself a windmill that provided water. It pumped water to the top. The pipes went into the attic of the mansion where there's a large copper tank, and then gravity allowed Mr. Abbott to have running water inside, while most of the rest of us were still going out to the pump and pumping by hand. But after all, he was John Abbott, and they owned the Abbott worsted mills in Forge Village and Graniteville. So we're probably the wealthiest family in Westford. They could afford a windmill and indoor plumbing and the mansion. His partner in that enterprise was Ellen Hamlin, who was a Scotsman who came here as a young man, came to be the partner in the Abbott Worsted Company, and with the money that he made, he built himself this house in 1876 when I was about 20 years old. I remember very well because there had been a house here, a house where all of John Abbott's children had been born, and so that house was moved across the street with the brick ends where it still stands today. And once that house was moved and the Abbott house was no longer here, Mr. Cameron could build the house that showed who he was in our community. Let us just go a little bit further so we can see the other Abbott house, and then we will work our way back. Westford was getting to be a town quite prosperous, and Mr. Sherman Fletcher was one of the prosperous people here in Westford. He made his living as a farmer as well as a merchant. And one of the reasons was that he was able to farm fruit here. Perhaps no fruit has done more for the prosperity of the Westford farmer than the blackberry. Some years ago, an article appeared in the Boston Herald entitled, "Westford, the Home of the Blackberry." During the years I have been away, there may have been changes, but I am very sure the fact remains that because of improved methods in agriculture and the increased number of varieties of vegetable and fruits demanded by the cities, the New England farmer, particularly the Westford farmer, enjoys a greater degree of prosperity than his ancestors enjoyed. He is fortunate in being so near the Boston market that his fruits can go by truck from the orchard direct to the market in a few hours without rehandling, thus avoiding all injury by change from truck to train and again from train to truck. The fruit reaches the market in as good condition as when first picked. And all of the land behind this house was for blackberries, and the whole family was part of this. They also had hired help as well, of course. Who helped them? We all did. Most of the help were Irish. Mr. Cameron had 2 Irish maids who lived in the back of his house. The Fletcher family also had Irish help, both men to take care of the orchards and the yard, as well as women to help inside the house and to care for the family. Now this large area, my heavens, how this has changed from my childhood. When I was a child, say when I was 10 in 1857, there were 2 houses here on the corner. One was lived in by the Herrick family, and that was actually where Mr. Cameron moved his house, moved the Abbott house. And then next to the Herrick family was the Groce family, Groce. Mr. Groce had been a preceptor, I believe the principal of Westford Academy. But when Mr. Abiel Abbott, who was the only Abbott I know of who was not named John, decided that he would build himself a home, he lived with his mother. Where the Butterfields lived, although that house burned, it was not torn down. John W. Abbott rebuilt that house on the same footprint, looking very much like the Butterfield house. And after his death, Abiel lived there with his mother until her death. And then he decided, just as Mr. Cameron had made his statement about his wealth, thanks to the Abbott Company, it was time for Mr. Abbott, the 3rd generation, to also make a comment and build this house for himself. This was the Abiel Abbott house. But in order to get the lot that he wanted, he needed to move the 2 houses that were here. So the gross house was picked up. Are you counting how many buildings we have moved or turned 90 degrees? It happened a lot in my childhood. And every time I came home from San Francisco, where I taught at my sister Sarah's school, I would say, well, isn't that interesting? That house that is not there anymore, it has been moved across the street, hasn't it, Mother? So the gross house was moved down to Boston Road, where it still is there today at number 21 Boston Road. And beyond that was the house of Mr. Artemus Cummings. That also was moved in order to allow Abile to build his home. That was moved down Graniteville Road, where it sits at the brow of the hill at number 18 Graniteville Road, and is lived in to this day. So this now left Mr. Abbott with almost as much land as he needed. He did buy the Osgood house and had that one torn down. And then he had one more, and that was by Mr. McDougall took that building down. And then Abile was able to build this house for himself. And he and his wife, Mary Alice, moved into that house right after his mother's death in the early 1900s. So they've only lived there for about 20 years now. I hope they start a family soon. I think it's a big enough house that they should have lots and lots of children.
Thank you so much for watching. The Westford Historical Society hopes that you've enjoyed this visual walking tour of Westford Center in 1919, which was based on the reminiscences written by Westford native Kate Hamlin in 1937 when she was 90 years old. This production is brought to you by Westford Community Access Television and the Westford Museum and Historical Society. To find out more information about Kate Hamlin or Westford history in general, please visit the Westford Historical Society website at museum.westford.org. Thank you again.